One way for us to begin to conceptualize the significance of bullying is to think about the vast number of youth that are directly impacted by it. When we reviewed the nationally representative data sets, these are large-scale data sets largely generated by federal agencies, we see some very high rates of bullying victimization reported by school-aged youth. Those rates range from 18 to 31% when we just look at victimization. When we narrow in a little bit more specifically on the area of cyberbullying, as Fred acknowledged, that's a particular form that is increasingly of concern among our youth. We see about 7 to 15%. When we drill down a little bit more into these data to better understand the sources of them and the variability across the rates and estimates across the various sources, we can see within this table here that the ranges anywhere from about 13 points of a spread as we think about percentages of youth that are involved in bullying as a target, with the highest rates generally coming out of the World Health Organization's data source. When we look more specifically at the area of cyber victimization, it's about a 5-point spread there, ranging from nearly 7% to just under 15%. So what might be some reasons for this variability in our estimates of the overall prevalence? Well, some get back to this issue of definition that Fred alluded to. Not all the studies that we had reviewed within this particular report had used the same definition of bullying. Some may have focused on using the word bullying, others have described that particular behavior. And there's considerable variation when we look at different ways that we measure bullying. We also focused, based on these data sources, largely on rates of victimization because there's fairly thin research around the overall national prevalence of number of kids that are involved in bullying as a perpetrator. And even furthermore, we need more information around the number of youth that are estimated to be bystanders through these national data sources. There are many, many other studies that try to estimate prevalence, but they tend to be smaller scale studies and not quite as representative nationally of youth within the United States. And so while we can get some estimate, we largely focused our prevalence estimates based on these large national data sets. So we need to have more information on overall prevalence, particularly as we focus in on some subgroups of youth that are especially vulnerable. We'll hear a little bit more about that from Sandra as we think about LGBT youth, youth of color, and youth living with certain kind of communities that might put them at greater risk for victimization. Another issue that we considered as it related to prevalence was the trends in bullying. Do we see changes over time based on these national data sets? Well, that question is a little bit hard for us to answer because we don't have a single data source that we can rely upon from multiple years. So again, pulling from these 4 data sources, you can see from the different lines represented on this graph that we're able to get some information from some years, but not all from every single data point. And you also see a little bit of difference in terms of the trends. Some of the data points are suggesting a slight decline in the rates of bullying, but not to a statistically significant level. Others are suggesting a slight flattening of this pattern. So additional research is needed for us to better understand the overall trends across multiple years. Here we focus back to 1999 when there was a big increase in the rates of studies coming out on the topic of bullying, leading it to make its way onto many of these national data sources. More research is needed over a longer period of time for us to better understand these trends. When we focus more specifically on the issue of cyberbullying, we see a slightly different pattern. While the rates of cyberbullying tend to be highest in 2006, which is one of the earliest data points that we could identify on this particular form, we see some indicators suggesting a slight decline and others suggesting an incline. So this is another area with emerging technology and differences in measurement that we need to improve as we think about trying to formulate solid conclusions regarding trends and bullying over time. As it relates to recommendations coming out of this report, our committee formulated a recommendation regarding the encouraged use of a consistent definition of bullying, and this is recommended for policymakers as well as researchers, so that way we can make stronger conclusions based on trend analysis and across multiple studies, and will help us try to understand some of the consistencies and divergencies among different studies. Another is having more longitudinal data sources that would allow us to look at trends over time and not just issues around cyberbullying, but other forms of victimization like relational or social aggression, physical victimization, as well as potential for bias, base, and subgroup changes over time.